Colm Larkin, what is your favourite game?
My favourite game is Baldur's Gate. When we were little in my family, there were 4 of us kids. We got a ZX Spectrum. So I think it was like 83, 84. So I'd have only been 4 or 5. Well, I had 2 older brothers. And we were mad for getting games for that. So Manic Miner, games like that. But then more advanced games like Elite was out on the Spectrum. Stuff like that really got me into games. So it was before consoles. It was that microcomputer like rage. It was the first time you could have home computers. You plugged them into a tape player and your TV, and you played cassettes to that had games loaded on them, and they were all written in BASIC on the ZX Spectrum, which was really quite simple to learn. And the ZX Spectrum was basically looked like a keyboard. The whole computer just looked like a keyboard, and it had above all the letters basic commands. So it's like go to or basically all this programming language. And magazines at the time, including game magazines that have game reviews, say like a ZX Spectrum game magazine, would also have loads of code in the back. Like 3 pages, and you could type it all in, you'd get your own game. So we got really into, playing games, but also trying to modify these little games that came in magazines and make our own. So I think it's also the kind of reason I got into making games. Now there's a big old gap between then and when I actually started making games, but I think that was the reason. So it was kind of, let's say I'd gotten a Super Nintendo instead, I don't think I'd be as into creating stuff, because we got a Spectrum.
And then from sort of that era of the sort of like NES or SNES and the Sega systems and all that there, like, did you get into any of those?
I knew about them, friends and cousins and stuff had them, got to play them. The Super Nintendo in particular I thought was amazing, like this was like a few years after that Spectrum, but things like Street Fighter and stuff were incredible. It was kind of like the first time you could have an arcade experience back at home. But for us, we kind of transitioned into PC. So we had a 486 in the early 90s, and that I got to play games like Doom was incredible, and RPGs. XCOM was huge for me. I was really into that, and that, like those PC games, the first Warcraft, Dune 2, which were like one of the first RTSs, and then Baldur's Gate was actually late 90s.
Yeah.
By then we had a better PC, and I was in college at the end, around the time Baldur's Gate came out, studying computers.
So it's fair to say that being on PC anyway just sort of helped you were more of a PC gamer anyway.
Yeah. So there's a whole style of games that I was that came onto PC. Nowadays, generally speaking, if you're on PC or console, you can play 95% of the same games. Back then, there were whole genres that only existed on PC. So point and click back then didn't go to console. So Warcraft 2 was like mid-90s PC only. And then there were console games that didn't make it to PC. So Final Fantasy games were just on consoles. So you definitely had this different like channel of games and genres that you'd be exposed to. And yeah, in our house we were definitely PC first.
You mentioned the likes of Elite, like big, massive, bombastic games in their own right, and Baldur's Gate would definitely be one of them anyway, or at least another one of them anyway. Like, what others sort of stood out for you anyway, from that sort of time, in that sort of adolescent PC gaming time?
Yeah, so Elite was interesting because I think it was out on Commodore and then got probably backported to the Spectrum. So the Spectrum, like, could barely show, like, lots of colors. And Elite was just these line, like, kind of like triangles to represent spaceships in space. It actually really worked well on the Spectrum. Like, our Spectrum actually, H key stopped working. I think that was for hyperdrive in Elite. You know, we played it so much. Back then, there was a lot of taking turns with your siblings. So you'd sit and you'd watch, wait for your go.
Mom says it's my turn at the computer now.
Exactly.
How many hours did you put in the Elite? Can you remember?
No clue. Luckily, the Spectrum didn't record it. God. Yeah, you don't want your parents seeing how many hours you put into games when you're in your early teens. Definitely not.
That's probably a good point.
I remember another game from Spectrum was Hero Quest, which I actually had the board game, and it got me into a whole like hobby of miniatures and stuff like that. But I was very excited by the like digital board game of Hero Quest, even though it's not that good, and that made it to Spectrum. Yeah, it was like a faithful adaptation of the board game, but without any of the fun aspects of the board game. You know, your friends. So digital board games nowadays are much more interesting. They don't just recreate it exactly if it's going to be digital.
Like, what's considering this show's MO is basically about digital games, video games in the traditional sense. I'll ask this anyway. Like, what sort of digital board games have sort of been stood out for you in that way anyway?
So much more recently, looking at stuff like Gloomhaven, it's kind of like a modern day Hero Quest, and it's a really cool board game I'm playing very slowly that has all these legacy changes where you're kind of opening hidden packs as you progress through the campaign and making kind of changes to your playthrough based on it. And their digital adaptation is looking at that, but also doing stuff like having kind of more roguelike elements to it. So more about playing with the systems, not necessarily about playing through a campaign with your exact 4 friends, which makes a lot more sense for digital. So I always had a kind of love of games, made like kind of tinkered as a child really with that Spectrum, making stuff with BASIC. Then forgot all about it. Went and studied computers in university, and then got a job not in games. There wasn't really a games industry in Ireland. This would have been, I finished university in 2002, and it seemed like I'd never heard of any game making companies in Ireland at the time. Otherwise I probably would have been interested. But I wasn't so driven to leave the country and look for games elsewhere, because there's definitely loads happening in the UK and obviously the USA. It was a few years later, like so around 2008, 2009, I thought, ooh, maybe I can make a game, because I got into Flash games. So Flash games had a big resurgence then. Congregate, Newgrounds, loads of people were making free Flash games, and they were getting better and better. And then you could start getting paid for them through these little sponsorships, small amounts of money. And I tried to make a Flash game, and it took me 5 years to basically not make anything, to not release anything. So I had 2 slowly going nowhere prototypes over that time. Then I found game jams, and I took part in a thing called One Game a Month. And One Game a Month actually gave me the feeling of progression that I was missing. So I actually finished really small and rough prototypes, game jam level games, but I finished a whole bunch of them in a year, and that gave me a lot more confidence back, and the feeling of actually finishing something and sharing it. So I ended up taking one of those prototypes and deciding to make a real game out of it, and that's what became my first commercial game, Gilded Engineering. So kind of game prototypes 2013, and Gilded Engineering released in 2015. And I gave up my job in tech in 2014, just to go kind of unpaid making Gilded Engineering.
And then from that became Gamebrinous.
Yeah. So we were lucky, I guess. It was quite successful. I teamed up with a few people kind of in the lead up to finishing Gilded Dungeoneering. And from release, we were basically done well enough we could start paying everyone. So it was 3 people then. A couple of years later, went to 5 people. We're still 5 people now. And we made a second game, Cardpocalypse.
Let us talk of your favorite game, Baldur's Gate.
Baldur's Gate.
Baldur's Gate. Let's go, shall we? As the kids say, let's fucking go, as the kids say.
So it's an isometric RPG with, at the time, groundbreaking graphics that, if you look at now, look like a joke, which is always the way when you revisit your old games. But I was blown away with the graphics when I first played it, and it uses D&D, like AD&D was called, 2nd edition.
Yeah.
So basically this
Advanced D&D.
Yeah, so this set of rules that I had been playing Dungeons and Dragons with, so I knew them so well. And then here's this computer game using all those exact same rules, so I could get really, really into it, basically, and min-max to my heart's content. And it did a lot of things that a lot of RPGs almost have to do now. So, for example, all the recruitable companions. So you make one character, but you adventure with a party of 6 characters, and all the other characters you find around on your adventures, basically. And you find way more than 5 extras. There's probably like 20. So you're kind of picking who you find interesting, or whose kind of pre-made character classes complement what you want in your party. And that, certainly at the time for me, that was novel. Now it seems like almost every RPG has to do that. You have to have companions, and you have to have more than you need, and you have to pick from them. You have to make friends with them, and they were really good. The characters were great, and they were all voiced. Now, not fully voiced, but they had all their various barks and battle cries were voiced, which for a game at the time was really, really good.
The thing I sort of want to pick out on in terms of Baldur's Gate, anyway, at least starting here, is that is that Baldur's Gate had 2 sort of sagas. The Ballspawn saga, which is the main series, 1, 2, and 3, coming from Larry, and we'll talk of 3 much later on.
Yeah.
And there was also Dark Alliance as well.
It's kind of action RPG games, right?
Yes,
but
that's right.
Did they then lead on to essentially Dishonored? Or I've got the wrong studio there?
No, you're thinking of... Are you? No, well, I mean, like, Dishonored was Arcane, I don't know.
I'm Googling here.
But in terms of hack and slash, it wasn't first-person hack and slash, anyway, like Arcane.
Yeah.
So, like, my this is me holding my hands up here. My experience of Baldur's Gate is admittedly very limited. Because, like, I've seen what's coming with 3 from Larian, and it looks amazing, but I don't know if I'm ready to play that just yet until it comes out of early access. But I will say, Dark Alliance feels a lot more up my street as someone who has not played D&D, whether virtually or even in a tabletop setting, because it's a more traditional video gamey type thing, whereas the Ballspawn saga, and therefore the mainline series, is more in line with
the turn-based rule set.
Turn-based rule set
very
of
much
D&D.
So. Yeah, which was a huge selling point for me. So for me, to many players, if you jumped in now to particularly Baldur's Gate 1 from 99, you'd be turned off after a moment. You know, your player character dies if you turn around quickly. You know, particularly when you start out, and you have to pause and cast spells, pause and you know, it's this whole like complicated rule set, and to do well in it, you kind of need to understand the rule set of D&D and min-max your character a bit, and you know, match up with the right armor and the right kind of weapons and the right like spell buffs to get your character just right. But all of that was like inherently natural to me because they used like a Dungeons and Dragons rule set I was already so familiar with. So for me, it was magical to get this like digital playground to min-max D&D rules in.
And you'd said to me just before we started recording here that you'd played a lot of D&D while you were young with your siblings, basically.
Yeah. So I have two older brothers, and they had this exact rule set of Dungeons and Dragons, and I got to play with them. So that's where this kind of love of D&D came from. That fed straight into getting to play very much Baldur's Gate. There were D&D games before that.
Yeah.
Like, they seem to be, you know, so like early 90s, Eye of the Beholder, they were more like they used the setting. They didn't use the rule set. So this was really interesting to me when it came out. Like, it basically had full D&D combat and leveling.
Like, this was... would it be fair to say this was the first game that truly used the rule set more than sort of leaning on some of the lore than anything?
I think so, yeah.
And again, like it comes back to it using a sort of modified second edition of AD&D anyway. Like, how did you sort of find? Well, obviously because you have that experience playing D&D back in the day. Like, you must have tucked it like a duck to water.
Oh yeah, it was very exciting. So I found I still have the box of CDs. The like boxed PC game here, and I looked at it and it has a 150-page manual. You know, so I remember when I bought that.
Remember when manuals were a thing back in games? Jesus.
So it's not just like a reference; it's like all the lore, all your like 30 pages of all the spells of D&D. You know, it's all kind of stuff like that. But I remember buying the game in Dublin basically, and then getting on the train to go home, and just getting to read the manual was already fun. So yeah, I was very excited to play it when I got to play it.
Whereabouts in Dublin did you buy it?
Good question.
I'm just sort of more curious than anything.
There used to be a Virgin Megastore right on the Liffey. It's long gone. Could have been in there.
Tell me about your character. What exact race, class, and alignment were you in Baldur's Gate anyway?
Wow, I haven't thought about that in a long time. I replayed it quite a few times, so I've definitely would have made a few different characters.
Okay, well, talk to me a few about that.
I've definitely made like an archer ranger a few times. I can't remember if there's a paladin in Baldur's Gate 1. Can you be a paladin? That's definitely a playstyle I would throw in. I know in Baldur's Gate your very first companion is a thief, which is good because in D&D you sort of need a thief in your party, and that's why they did that. So no matter what you pick, well, here's a thief as your first companion, so you can, you know, detect traps, for example. Which meant that I don't bother making a thief. You know, you've got one from the get-go.
Well, there is a guide here for the paladin class in
Okay.
the enhanced edition, so I'm assuming you could play as a paladin.
Yeah.
In the original manual.
I can look in the manual.
Go ahead. confirm my suspicion.
Was it there in this edition? Some of the characters were very memorable. Minsk is like the two-handed fighter you get pretty early on. I almost always had him in my party because he has like a hamster he carries around. It like uses up one of his slots, but it's always there, and he yells about it. The hamster's called Boo. So like one of his voice lines is Boo, go for the eyes, Boo.
Two out of his eyes.
I always remember. Go for the eyes. Yeah, you can be a paladin. Okay, so I probably did make a paladin.
There we go, confirmed.
Yeah. They had a good like mix of like evil characters and good characters in the usual D&D way. I mean, you still had to be a hero. Like you only had one like set of adventures to follow, but you could be evil. You could not help people. You could steal their stuff after killing the bad guys. I tended to stay away from that. So in D&D RPGs, I tend to try and go for like chaotic good. Someone who helps people but isn't like pushing the law too hard.
So talk to me a bit more then about the story side of things, like how you found that anyway.
The story wasn't that important to me. So the writing and the characters is very good, but the overall story, I actually can't tell you what the overall goal was. There was some terrible thing was happening, and it's set in like next to Baldur's Gate is a city in their lore, and you had to. I feel like there was like all the iron was gone bad, something like that. But that doesn't really matter. Like your end goal doesn't matter. It's your immediate adventures. So we have to go clear out these rats. It's one of the first things you have to do, which is great. It's classic RPG fodder. And of course you are some sort of fated like special person. You keep having dreams and special powers. It's kind of a usual thing in RPGs nowadays. And I remember more about the characters you pick up along the way than the actual overarching story.
That's actually a good point I sort of want to pick up on, because for those who don't know, obviously BioWare were the developers of Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, I think, as well.
Yeah, I think so.
And basically put, I can certainly attest to this, speaking from experience, at least with Mass Effect, and you'll have heard that earlier in the season with Mass Effect 3 with Aoife O'Friel of Ubisoft Massive. BioWare tend to write some absolutely fantastic characters in their games, whether that is Baldur's Gate, or even now with recent things like Mass Effect or Dragon Age, etc.
Yep.
So talk to me about that then, like how the sort of characters stuck with you anyway.
Yeah, it's definitely the more memorable side of the writing is the people, and particularly the companions. So not really like your enemies, but like the people you're adventuring with, and they always had a really good thing. And Baldur's Gate, like this first Baldur's Gate, was early in their like arc of making these kinds of games. But already you could chat to your companions, have like long conversations with them, go on special quests to help them with something, and become better friends. I don't think there was romance in Baldur's Gate the way you would have in Mass Effect and Dragon Age. I don't remember that.
I think what stands out for me is how BioWare seems to have evolved as a developer since Baldur's Gate 3, and how since then a lot of studios that are sort of taking stuff from them and putting it into their games. And funny enough, you mentioned how romance isn't an option in Baldur's Gate and all that there. It's interesting to sort of pick back on BioWare making the original Baldur's Gate and Baldur's Gate 2, and then what's happening with the recent BioWare games like Mass Effect and Dragon Age, and how those games are like how romance is a core pillar to stories of those games, the characters of those games, and how...
Imagine if they put out a game out now that had companions but not romance. There'd be outcry.
Exactly. Be like, where's my romance options?
Yeah.
I want my romance options.
So like Dragon's Age, which was a really nice game. I liked the Dragon's Age, several of them. Like, the romance is very much part of the game. And like a big part of the game. And a good part of the game. In a way, it's why you put up with the characters, or why you pick the characters you want to adventure with. It was very different when I first played Baldur's Gate. It was very much more mechanical. Like, oh, okay, what's their stats? Do I want them? Or what's their what's their class, will that fit, and much less about do I want to romance them.
Did you prefer the sort of aspect of companions in that they were more, how do I word this? Did you prefer them much more in the mechanical sense in that they would help you more in the gameplay sense than they were more of a narrative cannon fodder as they more or less are now? Even though there are companions in these games like Mass Effect, in particular in Dragon Age, that do help you in the gameplay side of things, but they're now it's sort of half gameplay, half story.
Yeah, because they used the D&D second, like AD&D second edition, which was quite a brutal rule set. I think to do well on it, you needed to min-max. So you needed to pick out your party of 6 with like the right kinds of classes. Make sure you had, a tank, a high armor class, or a well-buffed character. Make sure you had a wizard. There were a few things you had to have to kind of, I guess, cheese some encounters or get through things. So from that point of view, and at that time, I was very much into, how will these fit in? Like, how can I abuse this class's specialties, and how can I fit them in my party? And I remember at the time, one nice thing is, it was a very long game, and you'd be getting new companions throughout. So you could be playing for 15, 20 hours, and you'd still be getting new characters, and you'd be choosing to fit them into your party of 6, which meant you had to kick someone out, like, at least temporarily, to try them out. And that was still good. Like, it kind of forced you to move things around a bit.
The thing I sort of want to piggyback off as well, something I was alluding to earlier, is the fact that BioWare, making Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, and now making games like Mass Effect and Dragon Age with all these sort of romance options. And to sort of bring it back full circle, Baldur's Gate 3, it now has romance options.
Yeah, it has to. It's just kind of like the bar you got to meet for a big party-based RPG with recruitable companions. You've got to do it. So, like, Pillars of Eternity, Dragon Age games, Baldur's Gate 3, the new Pathfinder games. There's 2 Pathfinder games, Kingmaker and I can't remember the name of the other one. More recent one only came out a few months ago. They're actually really similar to like a modern Baldur's Gate. They use the Pathfinder rule set, which is, I don't know, D&D 3rd or 4th ed, forked basically. So they're really similar to that old feel of D&D. All of them, I think, nowadays. Romance is part of the companion, like, tool set.
Speaking of companions, what was your favorite companion from the game?
Definitely, I already talked to him, but Minsk with his
you did
with
say,
his
yes.
with his space hamster. So he called it a miniature space hamster, but it was clearly just a normal hamster. Boo! Go for the eyes. He was great.
That's right.
There was another guy. There was an evil mage you recruited early on, so you always got him because your party wasn't like at 6 yet, so you weren't making any choice about kicking anyone out yet. And I remember, and depending who you were clicking and telling them just to move across the map, they would say stuff. And I think he used to say stuff like life is disappointment and life is pain. He was just really morbid. So his voice lines always stuck with me as well.
Life sucks.
Yeah, basically.
And you die.
You're meant to be a hero.
They give that old sort of Vinnie Mac charm to it. Okay, so gameplay side of things, like, delve into that a little bit of how you found that. Anyway, obviously, it was built around sort of the second ed of AD&D, but like in terms of the nitty gritty, anyway, how did you find it?
The game itself was isometric viewpoint. You had six characters, and it was real time with pause, which is pretty popular. The Dragon Age games used real time with pause.
Inquisition definitely did anyway.
Yeah, but under the hood, it was actually turn based. So it was showing you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 seconds went by, and then it actually rolled the dice, because the rounds are in D&D are 6 seconds, and it would roll the dice for your attack. So it was like under the hood fully turn-based and fully faithful to like the turns, the rounds of Dungeons and Dragons. So the pause was just there to essentially let your characters just fight if you didn't want to do turn by turn. And in terms of more modern games, so like the Pathfinder games that I mentioned, they now ship with like fully turn-based, and it's actually much better. Like that kind of D&D, if it's not pretending to be real time, is actually better. The Divinity games and now Baldur's Gate 3, all the combat's turn-based, and it suits the rule set better, not to hide it basically. But yeah, that was the gameplay. So you'd wander around maps and you'd be exploring and finding monsters and fighting them, and pausing the game, aiming your fireball, or else if they're less tough monsters, just kind of letting your auto attacks happen. All using the D&D rule set, so trying to maximize your to hit and your damage and weapon proficiencies. There was a very nice feeling of finding loot. Nothing was randomized, so once you really knew the game, I remember that you could like quite near the start of the game walk to a particular bit of the map that was quite near you and just look in a tree stump and find like really good armor, and that was always there. So I really like that side of things, finding pre-made stuff. So at the end of a particular like hard encounter, there's always this particular magic sword or boots of haste or something, and that was always a fun experience for me, is finding loot and then fitting that onto your characters somewhere.
When you're playing an RPG today, now, like say a Final Fantasy, a Dragon Age, etc., like what sort of playstyle do you sort of tend to do you still sort of prefer turn-based, or do you like sort of real-time sort of action, these sort of combat, like you would sort of find in something like Mass Effect, for example?
Yeah, and the like Dragon Age Inquisition felt like real-time combat. I think it was pausable, but
yeah, it was, yeah.
I certainly played through loads of it without thinking about pausing. It was more like your companions had an AI and you were running around hitting like dodging and rolling and stuff, and that was perfectly enjoyable. But playing through a really well crafted turn-based experience is still excellent. The only downside is, are you fighting combats over and over that you kind of can't lose and you have to slog through? So as long as they've designed the game well enough that isn't a constant problem. So you're not going through these combats that you have to pay attention to but are a slog. That, yeah. And the good games make sure that's not true. They vary the kind of encounters you're up against and keep you on your toes. I definitely pick turn-based.
I am the sort of asshole who sort of prefers the sort of action real-timey type thing. I am a heathen.
Well, like
RPG massive.
Diablo was, only a few years before Baldur's Gate and spawned that whole side of RPGing. Running around, murdering stuff constantly, randomized loot drops. Just a whole different fork of gameplay, a different genre.
Like, this isn't me saying, oh, I don't care for those types of games. I definitely do. I like Diablo 3 anyway. But I'm not a very patient person when it comes to time, let's say, and so having that sort of control in my hand of just sort of getting everything done, hack and slash, real time, out of that sort of aspect, that's the stuff that I really like in terms of mechanically in RPGs anyway. That's just my sort of viewpoint anyway.
And I think that's why Baldur's Gate, the original, went with real time with pause. I'd say they didn't think it was possible to market like a turn-based game back then. But it's a pretend, it's pretending to be real time. It's very much the way the dice rolls happen underneath, it's all turn based.
So, in that regard, then, like, talk to me about how you found some of the quest design and some of the quests within the game, anyway.
It's, it's still a hack and slash game. So the quests are usually go there and murder that guy, or go there and rescue someone, clear out a dungeon. So standard RPG fare. I don't remember there being quests where you had different ways to achieve it, usually. So that has definitely become a thing. Like if you look at the Divinity Original Sin 2 games, which has led to them making Baldur's Gate 3 now, and definitely Baldur's Gate 3 does it too, from what I've seen. They went down the road of, yes, let the player have different ways to achieve their goals. So you can definitely talk your way into a place, or fight people, or sneak around and find a different way in, or like in the Divinity games, there's almost too much player agency because there's really weird things you could do, like put loads of barrels in the way of before you start the fight, and it's a valid way to play. Back then, Baldur's Gate did not have that level of complexity. There was some stuff where you could talk and sometimes, roll for your stats to convince someone. But it was pretty light. They did a lot more of that in their later games. But that kind of suited me. I quite like a hack and slash kind of game. If I'm playing an RPG, I'm quite happy not to have the level of complexity and choice that I see. Even in Baldur's Gate 3, it can be a bit overwhelming. It can be a bit too much. Well, have I done this optimally? And that can be negative for me to feel like, oh, maybe I'm playing wrong because there's too much choice. So in Baldur's Gate, and it's probably true of many games in the 90s, there wasn't that level of choice, which meant there were only probably a couple of ways to play, and the main one for that kind of game was combat. So as long as I got really into the combat system, then I was doing well. That kind of suits me.
What sort of RPGs sort of stand out for you in that regard, then, in terms of the sort of hack and slash aspect, or the sort of real time hacking or actiony gameplay in a way?
So more modern games that were definitely inspired by Baldur's Gate would be things like Pillars of Eternity. Made their own rule set, which was a very nice rule set, like different to D&D, but in that same vein. You still had strength and the same kind of stats. And the other one I've really enjoyed is the 2 Pathfinder games, which use the Pathfinder rule set, which is basically old D&D.
Oh yeah. I mean, like you mentioned those earlier, but I mean specifically in terms of the sort of real time, not the sort of combat that you'd find in games like Mass Effect or Dragon Age, basically.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I've played Diablo 3. It's great fun. That's action. I've played, say, Dragon Age Inquisition. Felt like an action game. MMOs even, like Guild Wars, has a kind of action facet to it that you're dodging and stuff.
Do you have time today to discuss our Lord and Savior Final Fantasy XIV, which has a 30-day free trial and can play up to level 60, and you can play the main A Realm Reborn story as well as what was it? What's the other one? What's the next one? Oh fuck! At one point during this season, I am going to get this meme right, and I will get it right.
If you can send me a free demo, maybe I'll try it.
It's out. There's a free trial.
The last Final Fantasy I played, I actually think is Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation 1. We got a PlayStation 1 around the time that I'd been playing Baldur's Gate. It was around that era, 2000-ish. And we got Final Fantasy VII. It was a really good game. It's so different, it's so different, like, to this, like, Baldur's Gate takes itself very seriously. You're in a fantasy world and you're killing people to save some other people. Final Fantasy, you're like kids in weird outfits and this big hairy bearded man going on an adventure, and halfway through your adventure you stop everything because you have to breed chocobos and race them. It's that madcap kind of feeling, and then the battle system is different, more JRPG style. I haven't played many of them since. It's interesting that there's so many types of one genre. There's so many subgenres, basically. And so many good games in those subgenres. There's another game from around the era of Baldur's Gate that used the same engine called Icewind Dale, which I loved. That's also great. And the cool thing about that was it was like there were no companions. There was no real story. It was, you got dropped into essentially a Baldur's Gate game, and it said make 6 characters of your own, and then there's a whole load of big dungeons to explore. Go like clear them. So to me, it was like the like combat and looting only version of Baldur's Gate, and that's a lot of fun. I think there's space for modern games to do that. So Pillars of Eternity now, when they make the first their 2 games, they followed the formula. It's a big campaign, you have a big overarching plot, you have companions, you explore the world, you get powerful, and maybe you'll romance them. I think there's space for a game that says no to all that and just says make your characters and go on a big dungeon crawl. I'd play more of those games.
No, fair enough. So there was the expansion as well for Baldur's Gate 1, Tales of the Sword Coast.
Yeah, my copy of the game came with it. So whenever I put Baldur's Gate, it was actually like a combo version, Baldur's Gate and Tales of the Sword Coast. It just added a few things. It added like kind of a few high level dungeons. It didn't change much, I think. It did add some quality of life stuff that I never played the version of the game without them. So I think it made it really obvious when you were looting which items were magical. It made them like bright blue, and I'd say without that it would have been really annoying. But these were the days before patches.
And then sort of delving away from that a wee bit, Baldur's Gate 2. How did you find that?
It was like a improved version of Baldur's Gate 1. I remember by the end of Baldur's Gate 2 like kind of went to a higher level. It started you at a higher level, and then you kind of went further in D&D. I remember by the end of that you were casting like time stop, like you're basically stopping time for a little while. So the power level was very high, and that meant there's a lot of, in Dungeons & Dragons combat terms, there's a lot of shenanigans that can go off. So you'd go in to fight a boss, and they'd have like triggers that as soon as you attack them, like all these spells will go off to like give them protective buffs and stuff. I think I prefer the first one just in terms of the low level fun. So I like the first few hours of an RPG more than the 30, 40, 50 plus hours. I like the experimenting with new characters. I like experimenting with new builds more than getting them to late game.
Why is it that you think you like the first few hours of an RPG than say the overwhelming majority of no, that's a bit disingenuous, but like, what is it about those first few hours that makes it stand out more, let's say?
I think I like character creation. So this kind of game gets a lot of stick for like, you need to know too much about the rules before you get to play, because you make a D&D character and you go through and you roll up stats and you pick a background and you do a lot of work before you get to play. I actually really like that side of things. So for me, I mentioned Icewind Dale. You have to make 6 different characters. I love that because it made me, I get more options to mess with. And then that first bit of play is kind of like validating that, where you're saying, okay, I made this kind of like adventuring party. Is it any good? Is it fun? Am I finding cool equipment and leveling them up to make them better? Later on, you're like, it's at the mastery level where most of your strategy stays the same. So the first few hours, you're like adapting your strategy and figuring things out. The later few hours, you're like, okay, before combat, let's say in something that uses D&D, before combat, I need to cast Bless on all my characters because that lasts a while. And just as, there's a hard combat, I have to cast Haste because that'll last a short while. and it becomes a lot more rote. So you have a system that's working for you, and you need to stick to it. So I think that's why I prefer the early phase of kind of figuring things out.
And I'm guessing as well, sort of that experimentation also sort of helps playing it as well.
For sure. And different personality types have different things they find fun in games. So that, for me, the like learning and mastery is very fun. For others, it isn't. So like playing board games, I actually like that first game where you're trying to figure out the rules. For me, that's fun. For others, it's torture. So I think that also feeds into that same feeling. So for some people, the first few hours of playing a really, hardcore RPG is a pain because they don't know how the rules work yet, and it's really awkward and difficult. And then the later hours, they're like finally feel familiarity with all their different classes and abilities, and they're finally having fun. Well, for me, that's the part where maybe it gets a little boring.
So we can't talk Baldur's Gate 1 without mentioning the enhanced edition that came out a few years ago anyway from Beamdog. Like, did you play that?
I played it on iPad. And I was shocked how bad it looked. Because in my mind, it was this like amazing looking like game. That's the sad reality of going back to play quite old games. And it's not just the look of it, it's also the usability, the interface usability. We are spoiled nowadays. All the games like just make things very, very straightforward and easy to play. Back then, everything was janky, and there was no shared way to do things among different games. So for example, in the original Baldur's Gate, you had 20 little squares of inventory in each like of your characters, and that's how you carried stuff around. I think that was still true in Enhanced Edition, but it's kind of annoying. So if you play Pillars of Eternity, anytime you're looting stuff, you can just say, yeah, all of this stuff just go into my like invisible place where I'm going to sell it when I go to the merchant later, and you don't even have to see it ever again. You just get money for it later. Like, that's just this lovely quality of life improvement. So yeah, there's definitely the baggage of playing an old style game if you're playing Enhanced Edition.
So yeah, elephant in the room. Well, it's not so much an elephant in the room, but it's a big sort of part and parcel now. When talking about Baldur's Gate, Baldur's Gate 3, from Larian, like. So again, I am pretty much an outsider to Baldur's Gate, but I am very much looking forward to seeing Larian put out Baldur's Gate 3 out of early access, because I really want to play it, because I've seen the footage of it so far and it looks fantastic.
Are you avoiding it because it's early access? You're waiting till it's ready for release?
Yeah, I'm just sort of waiting until sort of everything's sort of ready to go in terms of a full release anyway.
I've played a bit, but it's definitely now parked until full release for me.
And because I've heard so much critical acclaim with the Divinity games, like we had Divinity Original Sin 2 as part of the Game of the Year special episode of my favorite game that came out back 4 years ago now as of recording this. And it got a lot of praise. Like, I have it sitting on Steam and maybe one of the consoles. I don't know if it's Xbox or PlayStation or Switch. But
I've played through both of those original Sins, and they are excellent. And Baldur's Gate 3 is definitely an evolution of that. Like, they're very much taking their system and their game and the way they make games to make Baldur's Gate 3. And it's very popular, very polished, very excellent. They're turn-based games. They use the Baldur's Gate 3 is using the newest edition of, I think it's 5th edition of D&D faithfully. They're still adding their spin to it with all their like way you can like throw barrels of acid around to put acid on the ground and then freeze it, which were very much in their Divinity games. I think they're going to do a really good job. They're an impressive team.
I have a lot of high hopes for Baldur's Gate 3 anyway, especially considering the pedigree of Larian. I'm definitely optimistic for what the final version, the full release, is going to be.
It's a really good company to get Baldur's Gate, I have to say. yeah, I think they're doing a good job.
So what else do you like about Baldur's Gate 1 that we've not talked about tonight?
There's a voice line, so it's kind of like this isometric view, and it's kind of like region based. Like each point on the map is like I don't know, 10 by 5 screens like of movable space that you can walk around, and then you have to like move between maps. And when you try and transition between maps, your characters actually have to all walk over to that point. And if one of them is like wearing the boots of haste, which I think you get at a certain point, they run at like twice the speed. So over and over you hear the line, this voice line pops up that says, "You must gather your party before venturing forth." And that's a really memorable line for me. So I see that in like, it's like referenced as a joke now in more modern games. You must gather your party. They had an AI. I can't remember if this was more in Baldur's Gate 2 or not. But basically, because it was real time with pause, you could also tell your party to be like, attack anything you see and chase them forever, or attack anything that's attacking you only, or do nothing. And I can't remember now if it was in Baldur's Gate 2 that they improved on that, and you could actually go in and go, oh no, you should cast this spell at the start of combat, and then go fight people, or use your ranged weapon. And it meant you could play more like a Dragon Age, where you're not micromanaging every character.
So, what didn't you like about Baldur's Gate 1?
You had to change CDs as you got to different parts of the game. So it was on like 5 CD-ROMs. And at certain parts of the game, you have to put in the other CD-ROM. Because back then, you couldn't install like 5 CD-ROMs worth of game on your computers. It actually needed all that data on CD-ROMs, like that they were big storage media for the day. So that would be, that's a thought. Like if we had to switch discs mid-game right now, people don't know how great it is nowadays. No patches, so if there was a bug or a problem, good luck. I mean, but these are problems of any game of the day. Baldur's Gate itself, I had a problem. It's kind of like it's a long game, but like maybe when you're 20 hours in, you finally get to Baldur's Gate, the city, and I really didn't like that part of the game. It no longer felt like you had one thing to do. Instead, it kind of felt like you had to go into every little house and talk to everyone and find out more things, and I felt like it was too much, like too many things to do, because I'm a completionist, so I want to go and look in every house and do it all. And I felt when you arrived in the end game, I'd have much rather if it was more on rails, or a little more narrow. And their map system didn't work great for like exploring that city, because they just like cut it on like exact lines to fit their resolution, rather than like more like better regions. So I do remember in Baldur's Gate 2, when you went to the city, it was like, okay, you're in the docks. Look around the docks. Oh, and then travel to like, I don't know, the Merchant's Quarter or something. That was much more sensible, and that's much more the way like modern RPGs do it. While Baldur's Gate 1, in the city, you'd basically just kind of walk east and appear in the next like exact same kind of space, and there'd be stuff there. And it didn't work as well.
What would you change from a design perspective then?
Definitely now Baldur's Gate would work better if you actually went full on with turn-based combat. So if you think of Divinity Original Sin 1, had turn-based combat, like led with turn-based combat, and it was really strong for it. Like it lent into the turn-based combat. The turn-based combat was fun. It wasn't a slog. It wasn't slow. It was all optimized. The fights were over quick enough. And then you just, walked around a map. It wasn't turn-based in between fights. You could definitely do that with Baldur's Gate now. That would be a big improvement. And if you look at like really spiritual successors, like the new Pathfinder game that just launched, that launched with a turn-based option, and it's a really superior way to play it. Yeah, so I think leaning into that side of things. So like leaning into the things that like make the mechanics better. So you're playing D&D, which is naturally turn based. I like dungeon crawls. So I like when you go down into a big sprawling multi-level dungeon. And Baldur's Gate was pretty good for that. There were quite a few. But I much prefer them than the kind of overland maps. The nice thing is, if you really like Baldur's Gate like I do, you don't need to play Baldur's Gate anymore. There's better games that are like spiritual successors to it.
Like, would you not even say the enhanced edition would come recommended in that regard then?
I mean, it's very faithful, and so it's still got all the awkwardness of playing a game from 20 years ago, even the enhanced version. So it's interesting for me as a nostalgia kick, but I think for a new player, no, I wouldn't recommend it. I'd recommend other games instead, like Pillars of Eternity, Divinity Original Sin, or the Pathfinder games. Definitely.
That's an interesting way to put it.
Yeah, so I love it, but it's a game of its time as well. So I think the same is true. Like if we get to talk about my second favorite game is XCOM. And again, I wouldn't recommend anyone play the like mid-90s XCOMs. Because there's so much better recent ones that distill the gameplay and make it much less frustrating to play through while still getting the nice feelings of like tactical square-based combat.
Like I'm guessing like the XCOM games that come out over the past 10 years.
Yeah,
and Jake Solomon.
Definitely, yeah. They're really excellent. Really good.
They are fantastic games. Can't quite preach them enough, basically.
Yep.
And we'll get the honorable mentions in a moment. Top 3 Baldur's Gate games. What would they be? 1 at the top, but how would you rank the rest of the series? And this is bearing in mind, 1, Baldur's Gate 3 isn't out yet, and 2, I am going to allow for the Dark Alliance games if you have any of them.
So I haven't played Dark Alliance, kind of action RPG, I believe it is. So I can't rank that well. Okay, well I'll rank 1 as my favorite because it kind of like landed in my life at a time when it seemed like there was no other game like this. 3 is very impressive from what I've played so far. I'll probably throw that in next just because it's a modern game, like again distilling the feeling but not being overly faithful to the mechanics like the interface or anything like that. None of that is present in 3.
And this probably is, again, worth noting the caveat that Baldur's Gate 3 is still in early access.
Yeah, but it's, they did this before with their Divinity games. It's a very playable early access. It's not a janky half game or prototype. It's just a little less content. Yeah, which unfortunately leaves Baldur's Gate 2 a little behind. We could throw in Neverwinter Nights there. It's kind of a spiritual sequel to Baldur's Gate. It had like like player mods. You could have servers and you could run your own like mini MMO basically, which was pretty interesting. I found that very interesting, and again used the full D&D rule set. Gonna throw that in there as well.
Yes, honorable mentions. Go for it.
So big honorable mention, I just brought it up there, was it's actually not the original XCOM. So XCOM UFO Unknown was like 1993. The game I
93, 94.
Yeah, the game I played came out like the very next year. Was called Terror from the Deep, XCOM Terror from the Deep, and it was the exact same game except underwater. Pretty much. So it's a bit like the patched version of XCOM with a very slightly different setting. You were underwater and shooting harpoon guns instead of rifles, but it was very much almost exactly the same game. And that was the game. That was just the game we happened to get. We had Terror from the Deep, and I played the hell out of it, and it's a really good game. And similarly to Baldur's Gate, I wouldn't want to play it now. It's a game of the 90s. Games are made better now. They're much more playable, much more friendly to your time. So I do remember things like you couldn't find the last alien. You were like on a giant cruise ship. You've spent the first half hour murdering all the aliens, and then the second half hour looking through all these tiny little cabins to find one who's like stuck there and he's not coming out to find you. But a brilliant game nonetheless, and like the modern XCOMs capture this, but like it came up with that idea of like you send in 10 guys and half of them are gonna die, and that's okay. And like, you'd shoot down like this UFO ship, and then you'd land beside it in the one I was playing on the sea floor, and then you'd send your like little guys to approach it, and then you're like kind of looking at the door, and there's aliens in there kind of on Overwatch, but you still have to send someone in. Someone has to open the door and get shot. And that was a very fun moment. And it had a lovely power thing, so you did good research, and you got to like, you started the game shooting harpoon guns at like crab creatures, and at the end of the game you had like flying suits and like using the aliens' weapons against them. So it was a nice power fantasy there of like, by the end game you felt like you were crushing them. I mentioned Elite earlier on the spectrum. So a 90s PC game that I really loved was Privateer, which is basically just a slightly more modern Elite. You were flying a spaceship around galaxies, and you were like trading or doing some piracy or doing some missions. It just captured it very well. Upgrading your ship. Yeah, really cool game. I have one more 90s game. Syndicate. Do you ever play that?
Not the Bullfrog version.
Yeah.
I've definitely played the Starbreeze FPS version.
I can't imagine what that's like. So the Bullfrog original...
It's very uniquely different.
Okay.
I have a soft spot for it.
Okay.
Like, it's very, very massively different from what Bullfrog put out anyway.
So the 90s Syndicate was like this weird but cool like isometric game where you sent out agents and you had missions and you sort of took control of them, and you were shooting like guns at people, and it just had really cool music and a really cool like weird futuristic setting with hover cars and stuff. It was this very, very unique game. So I've picked loads of 90s games, and I play loads of games now. Like I play games for for homework, for my like learning like about what games are out there, and I play games for fun, and I enjoy loads of games. But I do not get into games the way I used to. I'm 41 now. I play games for entertainment, but I no longer get into games in like a obsessive way, I think. And at my fingertips, I have way too many games. Back when I was, 15 to 20, there, you couldn't get digital games yet for me, and I got less of them for money reasons. So you'd kind of pick games more carefully, and then you would devote a lot of time to them. And that's definitely not true anymore for me. So I can dip in and out of games, try them, kind of play them for a bit, and then drop them.
What was the last game that you sort of dedicated a real significant amount of time to, anyway, in terms of recent games, anyway?
I think I almost finished Pillars of Eternity 2. That must be from 4 or 5 years ago. I've dipped into some like non-single player games as well. Like Apex Legends is like a battle royale game. It's just really well polished, and that's good fun. I'll jump into that now and again. going back ages ago when Minecraft first started, I spent a lot of time playing Minecraft, which is funny because you're sort of playing to no one back then. You're playing in your own little world and making stuff pointlessly, like not getting to show it to anyone. It's been a while since I played that. Probably works differently now.
No, fair enough. I mean, like you said it yourself, the sort of takeaway I'm getting from all of this is that there's a lot of love more for 90s games anyways. Not to say that there isn't a lot of love for, you know, games of modern times anyway, but like the 90s stuff more stays with you a lot more than anything else as of late anyway.
Yeah, for sure. I guess that's just a factor of, you know, the age I was then.
Top 3 games ever, what would they be? Obviously Baldur's Gate 1 at the top, but what would be 2 and 3?
XCOM Terror from the Deep would be number 2. Then maybe, because we were talking about it, and it's very similar to Baldur's Gate, Neverwinter Nights. I did spend a lot of time with that when that came out. Or possibly something like Morrowind.
Ah, yes, you mentioned Morrowind before we started. Yeah, like go into that a little bit.
So Morrowind is much more like action RPG. And very interesting in that you have no class, you know, you can do anything you want, you can go anywhere you want in the world and just do fun stuff. Yeah, that was a groundbreaking game as well. Like that's probably a lot of people's favorite game of all time. Yeah, really cool game. So I remember buying that game, Morrowind, for PC and having this box that said Morrowind on it and had CD-ROMs in it before I had a PC that could actually play it. So I was just kind of, I don't know, very excited to own it, but not able to play it.
It's just sitting there teasing you.
Yeah. So, and that doesn't happen anymore. You know, the pace of needing like computers to play PC games kind of isn't the way it used to be.
Have you played any of the Elder Scrolls games since, even just a little bit, like Oblivion or Skyrim?
Yeah, Skyrim is excellent. Like Skyrim and Oblivion, they were both good, and Skyrim in particular, like, solved a lot of the problems with the other ones, and there's a reason that's keeps getting like updated and still getting played. Yeah, yeah. Skyrim is like the best of that series. Yeah, I played both of them thanks to, you know, having loved Morrowind. They're funny though, because you can do anything. Again, this is me being a completionist. You know, you'll travel over to a new town and then you'll have 1,000 new quests. That can be a bit of a drag. Sometimes I want less to do, like less tasks. That's led to some design decisions in my own work. Much less open-ended, much more session-based and simpler.
Well, would it be fair to say these sort of decisions help sort of lean to having provide the player a more sort of what's the word I'm looking for?
Like streamlined experience?
Yeah, a more sort of time-friendly experience.
Very much so, yeah. Yeah, that's a definite concern in the games we make. Is your time is valuable. Spend it well. Definitely, yeah. Because I feel that too. You know, I'm not 19, 20 anymore. I don't get as much time to game, so I want it to be well spent, to be having fun, and also not to have to remember everything. And this is where, like, actually the modern Baldur's Gate 3 and the Divinity games would have this problem. If you play them like for 10 hours in a row, you're having a great time, and then you put it down and you come back a month later, oh, it's painful. You can't remember, you know, you're like, okay, I can do a fight here, but then, you know, you're looking at this new magical sword that the monster dropped, and you don't know if it's good or not. You don't know if it suits any of your characters. You have to learn so much again of the like systems and where you're like you were kind of fitting into those systems. So those games can be really hard to get back into. And that's something we tried to work around by having kind of more session based games where you can kind of do a run, kind of leading into roguelike stuff. You don't need to keep track of too much. Everything resets. And that's certainly true for our first game, Guild of Dungeoneering.
And especially as well, considering how precious time seems to be now, more as a commodity and currency, especially during the middle of a pandemic, anyway.
Yeah, for sure. And, you know, there's a lot of games that are more like hobbies than games. If you take even Apex Legends that I mentioned, but like, you know, League of Legends or any games like that, where really to play them, you're not just saying I'm going to play once. You're saying I'm going to dedicate some time to this over the next longer period. And it's also true of, you know, MMOs like World of Warcraft. You know, you were dedicating a longer time to a game. Well, we've just launched a remake of Guild of Dungeoneering called Guild of Dungeoneering Ultimate Edition. So if anyone wants to check that out, it's on Steam, it's on Epic, and it's on GOG. And it's a game where you don't control your hero directly, you build a dungeon around them. And it's super fun, and it has short sessions. It looks like you're drawing an old D&D map. And it's kind of cool because, like, in combat, it's sort of like a little deck builder. The original, we launched the game first in 2015, and we just launched the Ultimate Edition at the end of 2021. And it's interesting because in the meantime, in those years, Slay the Spire came out and was immensely popular, and is a deck builder, a thing where you add attacks to your deck as you progress. So it's interesting now, new players will find our game and say, oh, you're just, you know, you're doing Slay the Spire for your combat system. But you know, our combat system predates Slay the Spire. So it's a funny one. Yeah, so check that out and look up our other game if you like, Cardpocalypse. It's a trading card game that's actually just a single player RPG. So there's a collectible card game you play, but it's all single player, there's no multiplayer. That's fun too. That's on consoles as well as all the usual PC places. I'm on Twitter at Gamebrinous. Yeah, that's the main place to find us. Or if you search it for our Discord server, if you search up Gamebrinous on Discord, that's our little community.
Thanks for listening to My Favourite Game, a podcast by PlayDiaries.com where people from the games industry come on to talk of their favourite game. If you want to listen to future episodes of My Favourite Game, as well as press play before they go live publicly on Play Diaries and other podcast platforms, please consider becoming a $2 tier podcast early access patron to our Patreon at patreon.com/playdiaries. Next week, They Could on Time Splitters, Future Perfect. Until next week, bye bye.